Well, let's open it up for questions. We have a mic here, and we also have, let's see if we've got somebody that, and I'd ask you, if you ask a question, please identify yourself, and please do not make a 20-minute statement. Please just state a quick question or a quick thought. So we have anybody? There's a gentleman back here. I see him in the yellow shirt. Number one. If you'd identify yourself and where you're from, and then make your point.
My name is Tag Demon. I'm from the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. I would just ask you how you feel that building the capacity in developing countries of their human and institutional capacity in the science and technologies that you're all talking about, how important is that in terms of actually implementing on the ground the kinds of things you want to achieve?
Okay, good question. Yes.
Quick answer.
Yes.
It's absolutely critical. So those 650 modelers I was just telling you about, they're not all in developed countries. AgMIP has teams in the countries themselves because we're not going to be able to solve it. We have to work with everyone so everyone learns how to do these very critical, integrated, holistic type of analyses, and then so that each country has and region has the capacity. So I absolutely said that's a very important question. Thank you for raising it. It's absolutely critical.
Let's see. Any other responses to this question? How we increase human capacity and technical capacity in the developing world? Perhaps relationships with universities better. The relationships have actually not increased rather significantly with the developed world and the developing world in the research area. It's been very slow and somewhat incremental in my judgment. It's a place where the Brazilians seem to have done a much better job than we have in the United States, and in China doing a better job. But any thoughts to his question?
So it's going to be a lot about adaptive research, which is going to be building the kind of science that Cynthia's talked about. But it's also going to be then linking it up with other processes, more of the integrative research that Rachel was talking about. And so we're going to have to do it in a slightly different way than we've done, or a radically different way than the way we've done it before.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Question over here. Got some questions up, and we'll start this way. And then if you have others, you let me know. So,
Paul Miller from Lutheran World Relief, an organization working on resilience in the Sahel. A broken food system. My question is aid, trade, and investment policies. Are we already doing an experiment, Schengen, in a sense? What of those policies should be changed in order to improve this broken food system? Are we not getting results from those kinds of instruments?
Okay. Anybody want to? Yes, Rachel?
Well, aid aid is changing, needs to change. We now have a climate and disaster risk screen on every project or program that we do in the least developed countries. We're going to have to get better at doing that across the board. And where aid gets spent will be important. Trade, well, more food is going to be traded over borders, and so we're going to need systems for that. We haven't talked about urbanization and the fact that people living in towns and cities eat differently, want to eat differently, and the complications that brings about, and the fact that 10% of our food is going to come from urban agriculture. Will need to have systems for that. The complete underfunding and investment in logistics and trade, agricultural logistics it's always been a problem, but it becomes even more of a problem with climate as a threat intensifier. So I mean, this is if you put a climate lens on, this is not business as usual. And it's going to challenge governance, challenge management systems, challenge every aspect of economic policy going forward. And smart countries are getting there. And smart countries like the US, where the USDA is one of the leading climate change advocates within the federal government, that's as a result of being able to sort of put those tinted glasses on and see a very different future.
Yeah, Jenny.
Well, on trade issues, yes, as you know, 2007, 2008 food crisis was exacerbated by bad trade policy, export bans. But the good news is for the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen fewer trade export bans. That's good. So we need to continue to make sure that no restrictions will be used. But I think more importantly, in the WTO negotiation, make sure that we can put something there. Countries have to be punished if they impose trade bans to starve their neighbor. On aid, we have seen resilience as a buzzword by many aid agencies. in preparing their strategy document, the EC, the European Union, the USAID, and beyond. I think it's more important for them to convert that buzzword to actual practice, to really link short-term relief to long-term development. And the WFP is thinking of doing that, or has been thought about that for some time, to make sure that their food aid will lead to long-term development. For example, a good case is Ethiopia. It's a productive safety net. Short-term relief, help to set up the social safety net system. When the crisis came, and they can use that system to bring the food to poor, hungry people very quickly. And in the meantime, the poor can also use that to build their assets for long-term growth. So more needs to be done. Something is already happening.
Okay, let's see. This lady right here, and then there's a question over on this side, too.
Hi, Lynn Brown, Harvest Plus and the World Bank. A lot of you have mentioned nutrition today in the context of climate-smart agriculture, which is actually quite unusual. That's not what you normally hear. And if I think about the last major ag challenge, it was the Green Revolution, and the Green Revolution never looked at nutrition at all. And in fact, if I wanted to be controversial, I'd say it could have worsened it by distorting the relative price of staples compared to higher quality foods. So how do we ensure that in the climate-smart agriculture approach and the breeding, that it's also nutrition-smart agriculture? Do we need to be radical? Do we need regulations in countries that say you can't release a variety unless it has at least as good a nutrition profile as the one that's out there now? How do we ensure that climate-smart agriculture is nutrition-smart agriculture as well?
Good question. Somebody?
Sure. Yeah, I work on this a lot. So I think there's two issues. One is we really have to put a much bigger lens on efficiency and effectiveness in this overall thing. We have a huge supply price problem in a lot of the commodities you mentioned that we need to bring into the diets. I'm not a big fan in low and middle income countries of excessive regulation. I just don't think it works. People go under the radar. I think we're looking much more at incentives, capacity, assessing risk and trade-offs. Those are the kinds of lenses that we need to look at as a positive force moving forward. We're not going to get very far with regulations or fat taxes or things in low-income countries.
In fact, we don't need to impose new regulations. We probably deregulate some, or sort of correct some of the bad policies we have done before. For example, the over-subsidization of fertilizers of staple crops. Most of the subsidies now are for rice, wheat, and maize. Right, at the cost of vegetable fruits, which are more nutritious. So can we remove subsidies from the staple crops and invest, particularly R&D, in producing more nutritious crops, including vegetable fruits, and probably ensure the food safety. So you don't need to, sometimes actually you don't need to have new money. You don't need to introduce new policy. Sometimes they actually just to try to correct some of the mistakes we have made before. I think the Green Revolution, well, indeed, the Green Revolution helped in feeding billions of people. But there are some issues as well, environmental impact and nutrition impact. So today, can we do better by fixing some of the policy issues?
Targeting that.
Yes, Cynthia.
Briefly, on the science research side, the communities have been so separated in terms of the modeling for the major crops and the economics of the trade issues, and then the health and nutrition was really totally siloed in a different group of people, different science, et cetera. So AGMIP with colleagues from ILSI and other places are in particular looking to try to bring the research communities together. Again, it's a process, not easy right away, but we're really working to, because that's also definitely on the research side, there needs to be progress in bringing this together.
I mean, one other practical example is the whole story of biofortification, right? So 10 years ago, is this ever going to lead to anything? 10 years later, we're on the verge of being able to provide biofortified food products to tens, if not hundreds of millions of Africans. And what is one of the issues that's getting in the way is some of the perverse regulations around seed distribution, etc., in the countries of West Africa. If you could create a West African market for biofortification, then you would get a huge inward investment into the region, because people could expect to be able to service that whole region. If you're trying to induce a private sector operator to come in and either build a mill or whatever just for Togo or just for Benin, it becomes a more difficult proposition. So, there are, pieces of the trade and pieces of the regulatory system which are not working for nutrition and climate smart outcomes, and we need to sort of really understand which ones they are and then remove them, as well as perhaps write new ones in the future.
I just want to reinforce a little bit something Cynthia said. My observation is that Napoleon said war is too important to be left to the generals. And when we talk about nutrition, sometimes I wonder, where is the health community? The health community is largely dealing with issues of treatment, not prevention. It's all over the world. It's in the United States. It's the fact that virtually no medical school gives very intensive training to healthcare providers on prevention. And so this is a big problem generically as we look at nutrition, and people try to pigeonhole it into the agriculture space. It's a multidisciplinary issue that relates to health, disease, and longevity. And obviously, it's not the only thing. When people are dying of, let's say, a communicable disease like Ebola, you can't worry as much about nutrition in that context. But this is something that we have to recognize, that the barriers and stovepiping of these issues has been particularly acute when we talk about issues of nutrition, which, in my judgment, have been given short shrift as we talk about other health-related issues. So just on my... just telling you a little bit about my bias here. I think there's two questions over here, if we might. There's one by Dave Lambert, one by Bob Thompson, if possible. So you can figure out who's there. Yes.
Thank you.
Take the prerogative of the chair and pick
David
a couple
Lambert,
people
and I had the good fortune to be Secretary Glickman's agricultural counselor to the U.S. mission in Rome. On Shengen's point about the inability of scientists to communicate science, reminds us of what Shaw said, that the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. But my question is, when we look at the leading supply constraints on global food security and climate change, could you speak more specifically to water scarcity in that part of the puzzle, and demands for farmers and water use and agriculture in the world, and what the implications are for the future?
So water-related focus, yes.
So I've just come back from Vietnam, where the perpetual complexity of managing the delta is now, going beyond complexity to, one hell of a headache. The saltwater intrusion as a result of sea level rise, saline intrusion, the policy so far has been to use both green infrastructure and built infrastructure and sluices to keep that at bay and to be able to continue the rice harvest, while you've got urbanization and more people moving into the provinces of the Delta. And then, to have the Mekong discussions at the intergovernmental level, but the pressures on that are pushing the boundaries of what's reasonable there. But then you've got huge groundwater extraction going on further up in Vietnam before you get outside of the boundaries of the country, which is meaning that the land's sinking as well as the sea level rising. So all of these decisions, which were good decisions at the time, aren't going to be decisions for the future. You've got three problems. One, do you let the delta just go back? Do you let the river go? Do you move to saline agricultural system? Do you take the risk and do that? The science would probably suggest that's a good idea. That is one hell of a political decision to make. That is what, especially when you're a weighty, bureaucratic, party-driven system like the Vietnamese have. And are we all going to be there for them every step of the way over the next 10 to 15 years as they do that and live with that? The cost of that versus the cost of building 117 kilometers of sea level walls, plus 9 more sluices, plus whatever else they're going to have to build because sea level rise is actually going to go even faster. So this is exactly what we're dealing with now. And that's a saline intrusion. When you come to then other parts of the world where, precipitation patterns are changing or disappearing, you have other problems. So I think one of the issues we find ourselves working with governments on is decision making under uncertainty. How do you make robust decisions where you've got so many factors that have to be taken into account and so many variables within those factors? And then where do you muster the political will to actually make that decision? Because it may be a discontinuous decision.
Bob Thompson.
We live in the golden age of the biological sciences today, and we've got powerful research tools that can both help increase the resilience of crops to greater fluctuations in climatic conditions, and also pack more nutrients into a ton of rice or a ton of wheat, make them more nutritious, such as the golden rice, for example. But yet there's such strong public opposition to genetic engineering and applying it to our food supply, when the same people are more than happy to use it to develop new pharmaceuticals or immunizations. But how can we overcome this opposition, which bears no foundation in science, so we can use the tools that we've got to improve the nutrition of our crops and increase the resilience to climatic fluctuations?
Okay. Who went? John?
So,
You can all answer this question too.
So I'll answer that a bit more broadly than you asked it. But it relates back to the point that Dan made about how do we get convergence between health, nutrition, food, and these kinds of things. And economics has somehow inserted itself as the major way that we make decisions in the world, and I think we have to use that vehicle. And I think it's going to be an effective vehicle for the kind of convergence around agriculture, food, nutrition, and health. The GM thing is really about imperatives. Nobody questions whether we make a vaccine for Ebola out of GM. They'll use it. We have GM products for nerve gas attacks, and people will use them. They won't necessarily use them to protect against nerve gas, or even their GM products, I'm sure, for the nerve gases as well. But so if it's an imperative, people will use it. How do we use economics to make some of these things imperative? I think that's important. For example, we're going to have a hard time packing micronutrients in to rice if we don't have genetic modification. I know we are. So how do we use those economic arguments? And I think this is where there's an incredible convergence between kind of agriculture, food, and economic development and health. Okay, we're sitting here in the United States with 16, 18% of GDP on health. That's going to be an economic imperative to fix the system somehow. India's sitting there. They're about 1.8 to 2% of their GDP is on health right now. But with this NCD, obesity that's moving them very fast, that's going to quickly transform into 5, 6, 8% and limit their capacity to do other development initiatives. And so using economics as a translating tool for helping us to converge in these things is going to be highly critical, and it's going to show, as the climate change economic analysis is, how urgent these questions are and how we're going to have to make some trade-offs, and we just can't have it all the way we want it.
Yeah, Schengen?
Well, in addition to economic, which is very important, cost-benefit analysis,
I would hope so.
but also the risk side.
Yeah, exactly.
What are the potential risks? And do we have certain mechanisms to avoid the risks? So we have a program here to help the countries to set up a sort of biosafety regulations. So the countries, the capacity building, I think has been mentioned many times, to help the country to build the capacity who can assess potential benefits, costs, as well as risks, and certain ways to avoid the risks is very critical. And again, the communication part. How can we communicate all these evidences, risks, benefits, cost to our citizens, whether it's the smallholders, whether the consumers, to empower them, let them make decisions, not let the politician make decisions for you.
Let's see.
But just very briefly, I think that public risk perceptions do change, and they can change quite quickly. Look at the attitudes in Japan after Fukushima, and so but their emotional responses, which then translate into risk appetite and an interpretation of which is better. And I think that we have to make the arguments that will help shift the risk appetite. So okay, faced with starvation and massive public health problems versus genetically modified micronutrient risk, where do I come on that scale? So I don't think it's static. I think it moves. The final thing, just one thing about science as a non-scientist. It's people don't trust science. I don't think that's universal. I think it's very segmented by groups of populations and populations. And one of the big reasons they don't trust science is they think it's been bought. So they think that you're getting whatever science somebody's paying for you to get, and I think that has to be unpacked somehow, and that's going to be a difficult thing. But again, attitudes will change.
Yeah, Cynthia.
I want to come back to Rachel's comment about discontinuities. I do think that there's this idea that everything is just kind of gradually going to be changing into the future, but it's very, very likely that our adaptive mechanisms that we know now, some of which we've discussed, will work for a while. But then there will be other in the adaptive process. There's going to need to be shifts and investments in that much greater genetic development, and then finally changes in basically a third stage of actual changes in the agricultural systems. So I think that by being aware, working that process, as I said, of addressing those risks at each level of the adaptation process, I think will go a long way to bring the communities and the regions along as those potential discontinuities occur.
And one other thing that's, everybody talks about big data today, but data is much easier to develop and analyze today. So it struck me in this area, for example, there are a lot of claims on all sides of this issue, which it's oversold and undersold both. I think the technologies are undersold in terms of dealing with drought, water, pest resistance, those kind of things. I think they've been oversold a bit by the industry in terms of the benefits, and particularly the benefits to society as a whole. The economic benefits may be there, but the use of data to try to demonstrate what impacts there are need to be much more transparent than they've been to date, because just telling somebody something's good for them in this modern world with people distrusting institutions the way they are just isn't good enough. You gotta, ask, as the old Reagan claimed, trust but verify. People want to verify today. Okay, let's see. Do we have any questions from the virtual audience? If not, let's take them from here. So there's over here. You got a question from a virtual? Well, let's get a virtual person first.
We do. This comes from Cesar Beloso on Twitter, and he asks, which ag technologies can best contribute to future global food security?
Well, we yeah. Does anybody want to? We kind of answered that a bit, I think.
Yeah, nitrogen fixing, you can add that in as well.
Yeah. So. And water we've addressed, genetics we've addressed, insurance we've addressed.
Yeah.
Land is going to be a big deal.
I think probably it has to be context specific. So that has to be varied by regions, probably even over time. Maybe sometimes it's just not just a one so-called a magic technology, maybe a suite of technologies. I think Margaret Rosgren just published a book to analyze 11 different technologies, and all these different technologies can contribute to food security in one way or another. So maybe a set of technologies, not necessarily just one silver bullet.
And also the development of human talent. So we're seeing a lot more people interested in these issues of food and agriculture than they may have been 30 and 40 years ago. And that may produce more entrepreneurial type folks who are willing to take risks to develop better technologies as well. Let's see. Okay. So there was a question over here. Do you want to? I can't see. So there's a young lady on the edge over here, sitting on the edge. Yeah. Right. I don't know if she is on the edge, but she's sitting on the edge. Right.
It's like sitting on the edge.
And you identify yourself if possible.
Pardon?
Identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Sky Lawrence. I'm here with Africa Agribusiness Magazine. And I have a question about African development and about investment. As Africa develops its agricultural system, what's the role that the private sector can play, as well as foreign investment in building a resilient system? And I guess specifically, would that, for building the resilient system, would that mean investing where on the value chain, at the farm level, at the processing level? Where do you think that the best place is for private?
Do they have any examples to give give her, of where this may be done? One I know for sure is in the soft drink companies. So Coca-Cola especially, but maybe some of the other companies are investing heavily in water retention, water quality, water conservation, because after all, what do? They sell water.
Right.
And so they're actively involved on this issue of sustainability because they have no choice in terms of their business model. They've got to do this. Coca-Cola is the largest employer in Africa. And so they have a big investment in that part of the world. If they want to keep that investment, that's just one at hand. I don't know.
Well,
but
seed distributors.
Seed
distributors, and the role that they're playing in making sure that as the weather, as the sort of micro weather change, so that the very specific weather requirements, village by village, that they understand that and they can get the varietal that will work under 300 millimeters of rain or whatever. I think the other thing is millers, and you talked about the production process. So bringing more production into African countries, but there are millers and now the investment is mainly south-south, but like Indian companies coming into East Africa, but they're going to be the ones who are working on biofortification, etc. So we've seen private investments in Tanzania, Rwanda, etc. on that basis.
Yeah.
Very briefly, then the apps that I was talking about on the cell phones for those seed distributors, the fertilizer dealers, the folks who are actually organizing the regional agricultural practices and getting the technology there to them, and both for current and end of season yield projections, and then having them realize that this is evolving and changing.
Yeah.
Well, under the new vision of agriculture of the World Economic Forum, I'm not sure whether you're aware of that initiative. They try to bring the private sector to Africa to invest in food, agriculture, and nutrition. So right now, the latest data we have is they have mobilized almost more than $7 billion to invest in Africa in agriculture, food, and nutrition. You can check their website.
There are some databases that will show you which companies, large and medium-sized companies mostly, have in fact invested in various forms of climate-resilient agriculture, and there are websites that, that information is available out there and is shareable.
Thank you.
DuPont has this International Food Security Index, and as part of that, they disclose, for example, who's doing what where, and I think that would be useful for you. Let's see. Okay, there's a question back here. Man in a blue shirt. Okay, well, that's all right. But after you, the darker blue shirt. Oh, okay, all right, okay, all right.
It's blue striped.
All right.
I'm Scott Bodie. I work for ACDI VOCA, and I wanted to pick up on the science communication issue about not getting, it's too much times peer-reviewed journal, et cetera. I think one of the problems within those institutions is there's no, let's say, performance incentives to do things other than publish in peer-reviewed journals. I think that can be a problem with that because, the poor researchers are beat up on both sides. You got peer-review publish, but you're not getting your policy briefs out to people, the decision makers. So are there innovative research institutions out there that are recognizing this could be a helpful part of the solution to getting information down to people that need it? Thanks.
Yeah, John?
Well, I'm new here, but I would say IFPRI is one. And
Thank you for saying that.
And no, but why? Because it's not just about incentives. We can't make the poor researchers do everything. They need to work with communicators. So there needs to be a team approach because we need them to publish too. And they have to get their stuff critically evaluated. So it's not an either or, it's building up the teams that can do this effectively and using new techniques to do it. But the communication is absolutely critical because as a science community, we have to engage with the public.
And this is also a growing interest of the major foundations. But I think all of them, Gates, Ford, Rockefeller, others, are very much involved in trying to get innovative technologies out, demonstrated, and commercialized. I recall recently, this isn't in the agriculture area, but I think Gates was involved in funding a strip that goes on vaccines. It's a temperature strip, and it turns a different color depending upon what the too cold or too hot. And if you stay in between the two, the vaccines are safe. And as my understanding, there have been thousands of lives impacted and saved because of a simple technology that cost virtually nothing. So, yeah.
Thanks, John, for saying that peer review is still essential. I absolutely stand by that. Absolutely, scientists have to continue to go through that process so that the knowledge foundation is as strong as possible as we go to implementation now, as we go to this next phase. That being said, in our projects now that engage all the way to stakeholders, the funders are now being sure that we have a percentage of our budget on communication, and then we hire the great communicators who can help us. And so there is, I would say, hybrid approaches developing, but we can't give up the peer review.
Just to give you some idea, so years ago, President Clinton, who I worked for and I was very fond of, gave a State of the Union message, and he talked about wasteful spending. And one of his examples was plant stress, on the theory that those plants needed to go see a psychiatrist, and why were we funding them? So I went and told the White House, I said, no, that's not what he was talking about. And it had to do with adaptability to weather and to pests and to all sorts of other things. Well, there was a communication problem that went all the way to the top, you know. Let's see, okay. There's this fellow, the dark blue shirt back there.
Sebastian Heath, and I'm actually here as a former fellow of USAID for AAAS. The question I have is, both in the US historically, the extension services have been a tremendous part of disseminating knowledge, and during the Green Revolution in India, the same thing. Do you see a need for extension type services throughout the developing world? And if so, what are the hindrances to implementing, expanding those services? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to take that on? Extension.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, first about communication, IFPRI actually invested quite a bit in hiring another communication specialist here and there. I think the communication division probably is one of the most fast-growing divisions at IFPRI. And there's one magazine outside called Inside Magazine, and the contributors are not scientists, are mostly communication specialists from IFPRI, from different divisions, from our regional offices. Easy to read, to check with that publication. On extension, yes, I think we failed tremendously on extension in the last probably 3 decades. The public extension system is broken, definitely broken. But in the meantime, the private sector, the new system has not come up. Although we have seen some new innovations, farmers organization-based, internet-based, but farmers organizations, internet, or this portal-based need content. They don't have good content. That's what I heard from many, that they desperately need content to be used by farmers organizations, even by individual farmers through smartphones or through internet.
Yeah, I would just say one, I think, good case study is Ethiopia, where they have really transformed their agriculture through an adaptation of the American extension model. And they've combined it with health. So it's not just ag extension, it's actually people extension. And it's not perfect, but they've made dramatic progress on getting information out to people. And they have, I understand that they have hundreds, if not thousands, of small extension units around the country that have been remarkable, moving the ball forward. And so trying to figure out who's doing it well, they happen to be one place where they've made this a priority. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on the peer review, which is that the system is evolving on the web so that it's speeding up, because we have to speed it up. This whole thing of like getting reviewers, and it took too long. So now there's, as you're probably all aware, there's wonderful new web approaches that articles go up for public discussion, public review, or community science review, and then as well as the science review. So it is being modified. And another exciting thing that we're doing in AgMIP is a data journal. that because before you were only, it had to be a study, an analysis, but the people who are providing the data, they should get the recognition for the data as well. So we've started in AgMIP a data journal in which there's curation and review and then attribution, so that there can be again the career advancement for data providers.
Let's see. I think we have time. There's a lady. I'm sorry, I can't see. Is there anybody behind the column
Yes.
that
Yes,
I'm?
there is.
Yeah. So let's take.
He's very persistent.
I have great talents,
Two-
but
two
seeing
hands.
like Superman is not one of them. So.
The one with the beard.
Okay.
Brun's consulting sociologist, and right now happen to be doing a little work with IFPRI on experimental games and community groundwater management in India. But my question comes back to the kind of political will and imperatives and issues like subsidies. We know one of the ways change happens is from crisis, drought, flood, fiscal crisis. And therefore, for policy research, can be very important and very useful to have some things on the shelf. So when the president or prime minister's aide calls up and needs something for tomorrow, there actually is something ready to go. And my kind of question on these set of issues, are there or could there be, the one or two things that, show government, okay, is ready to get tough and take some serious decision and act and look politically attractive. And just for an analogy, I'll talk about central bank independence of something that over a couple of decades went from kind of impossible to, well, that's the right way to do it. So are there a couple of things that could be on the shelf for the president, prime minister to announce in response to the crisis that would really make a difference and bite the bullet? Thank you.
Do I want to comment on that? Yes, John?
Yeah, I agree with the concept of never let a good crisis go to waste. And so take India where you're working, for example. I mean, we'll get to a crisis when it comes to water use, and we'll get to a crisis, and we're getting into a nutritional crisis as well. So using those as opportunities to unpack a lot of the subsidies and policy mistakes of the past, which were good in an era of food security problems, but they don't work now in a new era, I think is one important thing. But, somebody did cut down the last tree on Easter Island, so it doesn't always work.
Certainly, the conversion from direct government subsidies to risk management and crop insurance is a kind of thing you're talking about. And that was basically caused by lack of resources as much as anything else. That was a fiscal problem.
I think the opportunity is also very important. So now India just had a new government under Modi. Modi obviously wants to make some big policy changes. So IFPRI, PK Joshi is here, our regional director is here. So they are working to prepare some sort of a top 5 priorities Indian government should work on for Modi's first 100 days. And that opportunity shouldn't be wasted. Just like
cut the subsidies.
Cut the subsidies and what food security bill together with the input subsidies, output subsidies. Together, can we present a coherent stories to let the government know what are the options for them to do?
And final comment?
Well, I think that, so again, agreeing with the premise, I think that there are some generic things that need to be sort of done everywhere, but, how we're going to manage the water crisis, given land management and water rights issues in India, is going to be different than how we do it in Senegal or somewhere else. And so, but those are known knowns, right? And there are people who know that. The question is, getting to the point of decision making before we have a complete disaster. But I think the one thing, especially because we're sitting here in Washington, in most countries in the world, we're discussing the how. There's only a couple of countries in the world where we're discussing the what or the whether, or the if, right? And so, maybe the prime minister isn't ready to move, or the cabinet isn't ready to move, but somebody in the government knows full well that we're on the edge of a crisis.
Okay, so I just want to end with that point then. You say on the edge of the crisis. So I asked the question at the beginning, which is, and there are many people in this country that do not believe we're at the edge of a crisis. Let's be honest about that.
Right,
they're not in the intellectual world often, they're not in the scientific world, but they're often in the political world. Is there any question in any of your minds that we're on the edge of a crisis as it comes to climate change and agriculture? And maybe I haven't phrased it exactly the right way, but respond to my question. Any question in your mind?
Well, I think certain event will change people's mind. I think the Great Sandy Storm already changed lots of Americans' mind. The drought in California, if that drought continues for another year or two, then you will see lots of people will begin to believe, well, something is changing. But let's not wait until crisis comes.
Yeah, John?
So some populations are well into it, other populations are approaching it. I think it's varied, but Bangladesh, they know about this. They're worried about it. They're doing things right now because they're in it.
I published my first paper on climate change in agriculture in 1985. I've studied this my entire career. The long-term, short-term and long-term prognosis is negative. Lots of uncertainties, lots of up and down different regions, but this is, I like your phrase, Rachel, threat intensifier that we need to address.
And Rachel?
I watch on the 23rd of September because you will see a significant proportion of US GDP lined up with every country in the world on what needs to be done. The president will go and the president will speak, but you will hear from states and cities all over this country who have lined up with some of the most progressive things that are going to happen. And watch that story. The second thing I think is you've got to tell people what they can do. You've got to give them, so does it mean that they, we can all individually cut our energy use by 25% with just very simple measures. We can change our food waste habits. But you've got to get their attention, and that's an emotional thing, and it's about children's health and our health. It's not about storms and insurance plans and things like that. And then it's like, and this is what you can do. And that's where we've failed so far.